Chapter 1. It was a damp, fog-laden evening in late October when the singular events of what I have come to call the unfinished manuscript first intruded upon the quietude of our rooms at 221B Baker Street. The fire crackled fitfully in the grate, casting long shadows across the walls, while outside the muffled clatter of hooves on cobblestones blended with the low murmur of London's restless pulse. I sat at my writing desk, attempting to impose order upon my notes of a recent case involving a stolen cameo, when Sherlock Holmes, reclining in his armchair with a pipe clenched between his teeth, broke the silence with a remark that, as ever, seemed to pierce the veil of my thoughts. "Watson," said he, without lifting his gaze from the ceiling, "you are expending a great deal of ink upon a matter scarcely worth the paper it stains. That cameo business was child's play, merely observing
the obvious. Pray do not immortalize it."
I set down my pen with a sigh, accustomed to his unerring ability to discern my occupation without so much as a glance in my direction. "And what, pray, constitutes the obvious in that instance?" I asked, unable to resist the bait. Holmes waved, a languid hand, the smoke from his pipe curling upward in lazy spirals. "The housemaid's boots, of course, mud on the left heel, worn tread on the right. She had been pacing the garden path, waiting for her confederate, a trivial detail to
anyone who bothers to look. But come, I grow weary of such trifles. The world is too full of mediocrity to waste breath upon it."
Before I could muster a retort, our conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face flushed with the exertion of the stairs, bearing a card upon a silver tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her tone tinged with the mild indignation she reserved for callers who disturbed the sanctity of her household after dusk. "He says it's urgent, a matter of life and death, no less." Holmes took the card with a flicker of interest, his long fingers turning it over as he read the inscription. "Sir Percival Glyde, Baronet," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. "An aristocratic visitor, Watson, and one who does not deign to send a servant in his stead. This promises to be more diverting than your cameo. Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." Moments later, the door swung open to admit a man whose appearance bespoke wealth and agitation. Sir Percival Glyde was tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of silver, hair swept back from a high forehead, and a face that might once have been handsome, but was now etched with lines of strain. His dark overcoat was damp with the evening mist, and his gloved hands fidgeted with a silver-headed cane as he stepped forward. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice resonant yet unsteady. "I am told you are the man to see when all others
fail. I come to you in desperation, sir. A crime has been committed, one so baffling that Scotland Yard has washed its hands of it within a day." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him, his expression of detached curiosity. "Pray, be seated."
"Sir Percival, and relate the particulars. Omit nothing, however trivial it may seem to you."
"Watson, close your notebook and attend. This may prove worthy of your pen." The baronet sank into the chair, his hands tightening upon the cane. "It concerns my brother-in-law, Mr. Edmund Fairley," he began, his words tumbling as though eager to escape.
"He was found dead this morning in his study at Fairley House, not 2 miles from here. The door was locked from within, the windows latched, and yet, there can be no doubt, he was murdered." "Murdered, you say?" I interjected, unable to contain my astonishment. "In a locked room? How can such a thing be?" Sir Percival's gaze darted to me, then back to Holmes, who had leaned forward ever so slightly, his pipe forgotten. "That is the crux of it, Doctor," the baronet replied. Edmund was discovered slumped over his desk, a dagger buried in his back. The blade was his own, a curiosity he kept from his travels in the Orient. There was no sign of a struggle, no mark upon the door or windows, and yet the man is dead by violence. The police, Inspector Lestrade among them, claim it must be suicide, but I know better. Edmund was not the sort to take his own life. He was a scholar and a man of letters, working tirelessly on a manuscript of some importance. His death is no accident, Mr. Holmes, I am certain of it. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light I had recognized as the harbinger of his keenest interest. A locked room, a dagger, and a manuscript, he mused, almost to himself. A pretty puzzle indeed. Tell me, Sir Percival, had Mr. Fairley enemies? Or perhaps something in this manuscript that might invite such a fate? The baronet hesitated, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm upon his cane. Enemies? None that I know of. He was a recluse, seldom leaving the house save for his books and papers. As to the manuscript, I cannot say. He was secretive about it.
Even with me, he claimed it would rewrite history, whatever that might mean.
But I saw him only yesterday, and he seemed preoccupied, but not despairing. Something was afoot, Mr. Holmes. I feel it in my bones. Holmes rose abruptly, his lean frame unfolding, with a purpose that belied his earlier languor. Then we shall waste no time. Watson, fetch your coat and revolver. This promises to be an affair requiring both observation and caution. Sir Percival, you will accompany us to Fairley House. I must see this locked room and its contents for myself. The game, as they say, is afoot. As I hastened to comply, I could not suppress a thrill of anticipation. Once more, I was to witness the extraordinary workings of that singular mind, plunging into a mystery that seemed, at first glance, as impenetrable as the fog now cloaking the streets of London.
Little did I know how deep the shadows of that night would stretch, nor how intricate the web we were about to unravel. Chapter 2. The journey to Fairley House was swift, though the fog that clung to the streets of London lent an air of unreality.
To our passage. Sir Percival Glyde sat opposite Holmes and me in the cab, his face a mask of restless anxiety, while Holmes gazed out at the shrouded city with an expression of quiet anticipation. I, for my part, felt the familiar stir of excitement tempered by unease. A locked-room murder was no commonplace affair, and the baronet's tale had ignited my imagination with possibilities both grim and fantastical. Fairley House stood at the edge of Bloomsbury, a tall, narrow edifice of weathered brick, flanked by wrought-iron gates. Its windows stared blankly into the night, and the faint glow of gaslight from within did little to dispel the impression of a place steeped in melancholy. As we alighted, Sir Percival led us through the entrance hall, where a flustered housemaid took our coats and up a creaking staircase to the crime scene. The study of Edmund Fairley was a room that seemed to exhale the essence of its late occupant. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines cracked with age, while a heavy oak desk dominated the centre, strewn with papers and inkwells. A single armchair sat by the hearth, its cushions still bearing the imprint of a sedentary life. And there, upon the desk, lay the grim evidence of the tragedy. A dark stain of blood, now congealed, marking the spot where Fairley had met his end. As Sir Percival had described, the dagger was no longer present, removed no doubt by the police, but its absence only heightened the room's eerie stillness. Inspector Lestrade awaited us, his wiry frame silhouetted against the flickering firelight. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted with a nod, his tone a mixture of grudging respect and exasperation. "I thought we might see you here, though I'll wager you'll find little to contradict our findings."
It is a clear case of suicide, however peculiar the trappings. The man locked himself in, stabbed himself with his blade, and that's the end of it. Holmes offered no reply, his sharp eyes already roving over the room with the intensity of a
hawk. He stepped forward, his long fingers brushing the edge of the desk as he surveyed the scene. "The door was locked from within, you say?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. "Aye," Lestrade confirmed, folding his arms. "Key still in the lock, turned by Fairley's hand, or so it must have been. The windows latched tight and there was no sign of tampering. Sir Percival found him this morning, and the servants swear no one entered or left all night." Holmes knelt beside the desk, his gaze fixed upon the bloodstain. "And the dagger, where is it now?" "At the yard," Lestrade replied. "A queer thing, sharp as a razor, with a jade handle carved like a dragon. No prints, but Fairley's own mind. You." Holmes rose, his lips twitching in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Most instructive," he murmured, then turned his attention to the papers across the desk. I watched as he sifted through them with a precision that bordered on reverence, letters, notes, and what appeared to be fragments of a more extensive work written in Fairley's cramped hand. Half hidden beneath a blotting pad, one sheet bore the title, "The Chronicles of a Forgotten Crown," underlined twice with a flourish. "The Manuscript," Sir Percival said, hovering at Holmes's elbow. "That's what he worked on, day and night, these past months. He'd mutter about it sometimes, saying it would shake the foundations of history. I never pressed him for details. He was a private man." Holmes held the page to the light, his brow furrowing as he scanned the text. "A historical treatise, perhaps?" he mused, "or something more provocative. Watson, note the ink, still wet in places. This was written shortly before his death." He set the paper down and moved to the door, examining the lock with a small magnifying glass he produced from his pocket. "A sturdy mechanism," he observed, "and no scratches or marks of force. Curious." I scribbled diligently in my notebook, though I confess the significance of wet ink and an unscratched lock eluded me. "But surely," I ventured, "if the door was locked and the windows secure, it must point to suicide or some extraordinary means of entry we've yet to discover." Holmes shot me a sidelong glance, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Extraordinary
means, Watson? You've been reading too many of your tales. The simplest explanation is often the most elusive. Tell me, Lestrade, was there anything else on the desk when you arrived? A glass, perhaps, or a book out of place?" Lestrade scratched,
his chin considering. "Now that you mention it, there was a tumbler, empty, save for a faint residue. It smelled of whiskey, I'd wager. We left it where it was. It didn't seem pertinent." Holmes crossed to the desk again, lifting a crystal tumbler near the edge. He sniffed it delicately, then tilted it to catch the light. "Whiskey indeed," he confirmed. "And something else. A bitter undertone. Interesting." He set it down, turned to the windows, and ran his fingers along the latches. No dust disturbed.
"Here," he noted, almost to himself, "the room is a sealed box, and yet—" "And yet what, Holmes?"
I pressed, sensing that his mind was racing ahead of us all. He did not answer at once, pacing the room with measured steps, his gaze darting from the hearth to the bookshelves, then back to the desk. At length he paused by the armchair, bending, to examine the carpet beneath it. "A single thread," he said, plucking a fine strand of blue silk from the fibres and holding it aloft. "Not from Fairley's attire, I'll wager. His coat was grey, and his waistcoat plain, nor does it match the curtains. Whence came this, I wonder?" Lestrade snorted. "A thread? You'll build a case on that, will you?" Holmes tucked the strand into an envelope from his pocket, his expression inscrutable. "A case, Lestrade, is built on what others overlook. I shall need to see the dagger, and I must speak with the servants. Sir Percival, you will remain here. I may have further questions. Watson, come, we have work to do." As we followed him from the room, I could not shake the feeling that we stood upon the precipice of a labyrinth, its twists and turns concealed within the silent study. Holmes had seen something, perhaps many things, that escaped me, and though I recorded the wet ink, the whiskey tumbler, and the blue thread with care, their meaning remained as opaque as the fog outside. What dark currents flowed beneath this tragedy I could not yet fathom, but I knew that Sherlock Holmes would leave no stone unturned until the truth lay bare before us. Chapter 3. The air of Fairley House grew heavier as we descended from the study, the weight of the unanswered questions pressing upon me like the fog that shrouded the streets beyond. Sherlock Holmes, however, moved with the purposeful stride of a man who had glimpsed the first threads of a pattern, though he vouchsafed no hint of his thoughts. Inspector Lestrade had departed for Scotland Yard, promising to arrange access to the dagger, leaving Holmes and me to pursue our inquiries among the household. Sir Percival Glyde awaited us in the drawing-room, his silver hair glinting in the gaslight as he paced before a portrait of a stern-faced ancestor. "The servants are at your disposal, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice taut with strain. "Though I cannot imagine what they might tell you. They're
a loyal lot. Most of them have been with the family for years."
Holmes settled into a high-backed chair, steepling his fingers before him. "Loyalty is a fine quality, Sir Percival," he replied, "but it is often a mask for other motives. I shall begin with the footman who admitted us." His hands trembled when he took my coat, and his eyes avoided mine. A trifle, perhaps, but trifles are the bricks of truth. At Holmes's request, the footman was summoned. He entered with a hesitant step, a young man of perhaps 25, tall and wiry, with a shock of dark hair and a complexion that bore the pallor of sleepless nights. His name, we learned, was Thomas Reed, and he stood before us with his
hands clasped tightly behind his back, as though to still their shaking.
"Mr. Reed," Holmes began, his tone deceptively mild, "you were in service last night, I presume, when Mr. Fairley met his end. Tell me what you recall, every sound, every movement, however insignificant." Reed swallowed hard, his gaze flickering to Sir Percival before returning to the floor. "It was a quiet night, sir," he said in a low voice. "Mr. Fairley took his supper in the study, as he often did, cold meat and a glass of whiskey, brought up by me around 8. He told me not to disturb him after that. He was working, he said. I heard nothing unusual, no cries, no footsteps. The house was still." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And yet a man died violently within these walls. Have you heard anything at all? No knock at the door, no rustle of movement?" "Nothing, sir," Reed insisted, though a bead of sweat glistened at his temple. "I was in the servants' hall most of the night, save when I locked up at 10. The study door was shut, and the key was inside with Mr. Fairley. I saw it myself when I passed by earlier." "A meticulous observation," Holmes remarked, though his tone carried a faint edge of irony. "And this morning, who discovered the body?" "That was me, sir," Reed admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sir Percival came at dawn, and we forced the door when Mr. Fairley didn't answer his knock. I saw him there, slumped over the desk, the dagger in his back. I'll never forget it." Holmes rose abruptly, circling the footman with the slow deliberation of a predator assessing its prey. "A harrowing sight, no doubt. Tell me, Reed, how long have you been in Mr. Fairley's employ?" 2 years, sir," the footman replied. "I came from a house in Chelsea. Good references, all proper." "And your relations with your master?" Were they amicable? Reed hesitated, his fingers tightening behind his back. He was a fair man, sir, but distant, kept to himself mostly. We didn't speak much beyond orders. Holmes paused, his gaze piercing. And yet you seem uncommonly shaken for a man who merely fetched supper. That blue waistcoat you wear, silk. Unusual for a footman's wages. The young man flushed, tugging at the garment in question. A gift, sir, from my sister. She's a seamstress in Covent Garden, does well for herself. Does she indeed? Holmes murmured, then turned to me with a faint smile. Watson, note the waistcoat, blue silk, finely stitched. A generous sister, to be sure. That will be all for now, Reed. You may go. As the footman departed, Sir Percival shook his head. You suspect him, Mr. Holmes. Thomas has been nothing but reliable. A bit nervous, perhaps, but murder? It's unthinkable. Unthinkable, perhaps, Holmes replied, but not impossible. The man's story is smooth, too smooth, one might say, and his hands betray him. They tremble not from grief, but from fear. Watson, what did you make of him? I closed my notebook, frowning as I considered the interview. He seemed rattled, certainly, I said. And that business about the waistcoat, it's odd, I'll grant you. But how could he have done it, Holmes? The door was locked and the key was inside. Unless he's a phantom, I don't see how he could have stabbed fairly and escaped. Holmes chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. A phantom, Watson? You do have a flair for the dramatic. No, the explanation lies not in the supernatural, but the mundane, though we have yet to uncover it. Reed is a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole. Sir Percival, I must see the servants' hall and the passage to the study. Every step of this house may hold a clue. We followed him through the dim corridors of Fairley House, the silence broken only by the creak of floorboards beneath our feet. In the servants' hall, a narrow room with a long table and a single window, Holmes examined the floor, the walls, and even the hearth, his magnifying glass flashing in the lamplight. At length he paused by the door leading to the main house, crouching to inspect the threshold. A scuff mark, he said, tracing a faint abrasion with his finger. Recent, and from a boot, not a slipper. Someone passed here in haste and not long ago. He straightened, his expression inscrutable. The net tightens, Watson. Reed's tale may hold water, but there are leaks aplenty. As we returned to the drawing room, I could not shake the growing conviction that Thomas Reed was more than that. He appeared. The circumstantial evidence, the trembling hands, the silk waistcoat, his proximity to the study, pointed an accusing finger, yet Holmes's cryptic remarks suggested a deeper game. Was Reed the culprit, cleverly masking his guilt behind a locked door? Or was he, as I began to suspect, a pawn in a scheme far more intricate than we yet understood? Only time and Holmes's relentless mind would tell. Chapter 4. The gaslights of Fairley House flickered as the night wore on, casting long shadows that danced across the drawing-room walls. Sir Percival Glyde had retired to a corner with a glass of brandy, his nerves visibly frayed, while Holmes stood by the hearth, his silhouette stark against the glow. I had sat near the window, my notebook on my knee, recording the details of our interview with Thomas Reed. The footman's trembling hands and improbable silk waistcoat lingered in my mind, painting him as the most likely architect of this grim affair. Yet Holmes's silence suggested he was not so easily persuaded. The door opened to admit Inspector Lestrade, his overcoat damp with the mist that clung to London streets. He carried a small wooden box, which he set on the table triumphantly. "Here's your dagger, Holmes," he said, lifting the lid to reveal the weapon. Jade handle, sharp as sin, just as I told you. Fairley's prints are on it, and no one else's.
I've half a mind to close this case tonight. Suicide or not, it's as plain as day. I leaned forward to examine the dagger, a curious piece indeed. The blade gleamed with a cold, lethal edge, while the handle, carved in the likeness of a
coiled dragon, shimmered with an eerie green hue. A sinister thing, I remarked. But if only Fairley's prints are upon it, how could Reed or anyone have wielded it? Lestrade shrugged, folding his arms. That's the rub, Doctor. Locked room, key inside, dagger in his back. It's a puzzle, I'll grant you, but the simplest answer is often the right one. Fairley did himself in, queer as it seems. Holmes took the dagger with a delicate grip, turning it slowly in the light. His eyes narrowed as he studied the blade, then the handle, his fingers tracing the dragon's contours. A fine piece of
craftsmanship, he murmured. Yet. His voice trailed off, and for a moment he stood motionless as though lost in some private reverie. Then, with a sudden motion, he set the dagger down and crossed to the desk where Fairley's papers still lay scattered.
"Watson," he said abruptly, "fetch me that tumbler from the study. And Lestrade, I'll need a sample of that whiskey Fairley drank. Surely the decanter remains upstairs." I hastened to comply, puzzled by his sudden shift, while Lestrade grumbled, but followed suit. We returned moments later, I with the crystal tumbler, and Lestrade with a half-empty decanter of amber liquid. Holmes took both, holding the tumbler to his nose once more before pouring a small measure from the decanter and sniffing again. A faint smile flickered across his lips, gone as quickly as it came. "Most illuminating," he said, setting the items aside. "Sir Percival, tell me, did your brother-in-law have a fondness for almonds? A taste for marzipan, perhaps?" The baronet frowned, clearly taken aback. "Almonds? No, not that I recall. He preferred savoury things, meats and cheeses. Why do you ask?" Holmes waved a dismissive hand. "A passing curiosity. No matter." He turned to the manuscript pages, lifting the chronicles of a forgotten crown sheet and scanning it again. His fingers paused over a single line, half obscured by a blot of ink. "The crown lies buried where none dare seek." He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, his expression inscrutable. "Holmes," I ventured, unable to contain my impatience. "What is it?" "You've found something, haven't you?" He glanced at me, his grey eyes gleaming with a light I knew too well, the spark of discovery. "Have I, Watson?" "Perhaps. But the game is not yet ripe for revelation. Lestrade, you may cling to your suicide theory if it comforts you. I shall pursue a different thread. Sir Percival, I must borrow this tumbler and a whiskey sample. We shall return tomorrow." Lestrade snorted, retrieving the dagger and box. "Pursue? What you like, Holmes. I've seen enough locked room cases to know they're rarely what they seem, but this one's as good as done. Reed's nerves don't make him a murderer, and that dagger seals it." As we stepped into the foggy night, I could not shake the certainty that Holmes had unearthed a clue of singular import, one he chose to conceal from us all. The tumbler, the whiskey, the almond scent he'd hinted at. What did they signify? I recalled the bitter undertone he'd detected earlier, and a chill ran through me. Poison, perhaps? Yet how could poison explain a dagger in the back, in a room locked tight as a vault? My mind raced with possibilities, each more improbable than the last, while Holmes strode beside me, his silence a wall I could not breach. "Confound it, Holmes," I said at length as we neared Baker Street. "You might at least give me a hint. Reed's looking guiltier by the hour, and Lestrade's ready to wash his hands of it. What's this about almonds?" He chuckled a low, enigmatic sound. "Patience, Watson. Reed may be a cog in the machine, but he is not the engine. As for almonds, let us say that some scents linger where they ought not. Sleep on it, my dear fellow. Tomorrow we shall see what Fairley's manuscript has to whisper in our ears. Back in our rooms, I watched as Holmes placed the tumbler and whiskey sample upon the mantel, his movements precise and deliberate. He lit his pipe and sank into his armchair, the smoke curling upward like the tendrils of the mystery itself. I knew better than to press him further when Sherlock Holmes chose to withhold. No force short of the solution would pry it loose. Yet, as I retired to my bed, the image of that dragon-handled dagger and the faint scent of almonds haunted my dreams, whispering of a truth still shrouded in shadow. Chapter 5. The morning of October 31st dawned grey and cheerless. The previous night's fog thickened into a pall smothered London in its embrace. I awoke to find Sherlock Holmes already at work, his dressing gown drawn tight about his lean frame as he bent over the mantel, the tumbler and whiskey sample from Fairley House, arrayed before him like specimens in a laboratory. A faint, acrid scent hung in the air, some chemical test, no doubt, and his eyes burned with an intensity that bespoke a mind racing far ahead of mine. "Good heavens, Holmes," I exclaimed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Have you been at it?"
All night? What's become of the whiskey? He straightened, a thin smile playing upon his lips. "A most fruitful experiment, Watson," he replied, gesturing to a small vial of cloudy liquid beside the tumbler. The whiskey, as I suspected, was more
than it seemed. But come, breakfast can wait. We return to Fairley House at once. This tapestry has a thread loose, and I mean to pull it. His urgency brooked no argument, and within the hour we were rattling through the fog-bound streets in a hansom cab, the clatter of hooves a staccato counterpoint to my racing thoughts. The almond scent, the dagger and Thomas Reed's trembling
hands swirled in my mind, yet I could not fathom how they coalesced into the picture Holmes so clearly saw. His silence during the journey was absolute, his gaze fixed upon some invisible horizon, and I knew better than to interrupt the storm
brewing within him. We arrived at Fairley House to find the household in subdued chaos. Sir Percival Glyde met us at the door, his face ashen and his hands clasped in agitation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank heaven you've come," he cried. "Something dreadful has happened. The manuscript, Fairley's manuscript, it's gone." Holmes's eyes sharpened, though his voice remained calm. "Gone, you say? When was this discovered?" "This morning, not an hour ago," Sir Percival replied, leading us toward the study. I went to look over the papers myself, thinking to secure them after yesterday's events. But when I reached the desk, the bulk of the manuscript, dozens of pages, was missing. Only a few scattered sheets remained, the ones you saw last night. We entered the study, and the truth of his words struck me at once. The desk, once littered with Fairley's cramped handwriting, now bore only a handful of pages, including the titled sheet Holmes had pocketed and returned. The bloodstain remained, a grim reminder of the violence that had preceded this new outrage, but the room felt emptier, as though its very soul had been stripped away. Holmes crossed to the desk with a swiftness that belied his earlier languor, his magnifying glass flashing as he examined the surface. "No signs of forced entry," he murmured. "And the door was locked again last night, I presume?" "Yes," Sir Percival confirmed. "I locked it myself after you left, and the key stayed with me. The windows, look for yourself, they're still latched."
Tight. I peered at the windows, their iron frames unyielding, and shook my head. Another locked room mystery, Holmes? First a murder, now a theft. How can this be?
He did not answer immediately, his attention shifting to the floor beneath the desk. He knelt, his fingers brushing the carpet, then rose with a faint exclamation. "A smear of wax," he said, holding a hand smudged with a pale residue. "Candle. Wax recently dripped. And here," he pointed to a faint scuff mark near the hearth, identical to the one we'd seen in the servants' hall. "The same boot, Watson. Our visitor is consistent, if nothing else." Sir Percival's brow furrowed. "Wax? But the servants use gaslight. Fairly too, save when he worked late. And the manuscript was here last night. I saw it myself." Holmes' gaze darted to the bookshelves, then back to the desk, his movements growing erratic as he paced the room. "A thief in the night," he muttered, almost to himself. "Yet no lock picked, no window breached. The wax, the whiskey, the thread. Yes,
It begins to cohere. He spun abruptly to face Sir Percival.
who else had access to this room after we departed? The servants? Reed, perhaps?" "Reed was off duty," Sir Percival said, though uncertainty crept into his tone. "The housemaid Ellen tidied the drawing room, but no one came up here. Also,
I thought, could someone have slipped in unseen? Holmes's lips tightened, and he turned to the hearth, running his fingers along the mantel. Unseen, yes, he said softly, but not unfelt. Watson, fetch Reed again, and Ellen too. I must know their every step last night. I hastened to summon the servants, reeling at this fresh twist. The theft of the manuscript raised the stakes beyond. Mere murder, Fairley's work, whatever its secrets, had drawn a predator into this locked domain. Reed appeared first. His pallor was more pronounced, his blue silk waistcoat starkly contrasting his anxious demeanour.
Ellen followed a slight, mousy girl with downcast eyes, clutching a duster like a shield. "Mr. Reed," Holmes began, his tone sharp. "Where were you between midnight and dawn?" "In my room, sir," Reed replied, his voice unsteady. "I turned in after."
Locking up, slept through till Sir Percival's arrival. "And you, Ellen?" Holmes pressed, fixing the housemaid with a piercing stare. "Cleaning the downstairs, sir," she said faintly. "Then bed, same as Thomas? I heard nothing. No one about."
Holmes nodded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of dissatisfaction. He dismissed them with a wave, then turned to me, his voice low and urgent. "Watson, the wax is the key, or part of it. Fairley's death was no end but a beginning. The manuscripts—"
"Absence is no coincidence. It's the prize, and someone risks much to claim it." "But who, Holmes?" I demanded, exasperation breaking through. "Reed? Ellen? A ghost? And how with every door barred?" He smiled, a rare, fleeting thing. "Not a
"Ghost, Watson, but a shadow that moves with purpose. The sequence emerges, but it is not yet complete. We must test the whiskey further, and I must see that dagger again. The game grows perilous, and I relish it." As we departed the study, Holmes's erratic energy filled me with awe and unease. The theft had lit a fire within him, yet the clues, wax, whiskey, a missing manuscript, only deepened the enigma. Whatever truth lay buried in Fairley's pages, it had claimed one life and now threatened more, and I could only follow in Holmes's wake, trusting that his genius would pierce the fog before the shadow struck again. Chapter 6. The fog had not lifted by midday, cloaking Baker Street in a shroud that seemed to mirror the mystery enveloping us. Sherlock Holmes sat at his chemical bench, the tumbler and whiskey sample before him, his long fingers deftly manipulating a pipette as he added a reagent to the cloudy vial from his earlier experiment. A sharp hiss and a faint blue tinge confirmed some silent hypothesis, and he leaned back with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "Cyanide, Watson," he said abruptly, his voice cutting through the stillness of our rooms. A trace, but unmistakable. The whiskey was laced, not enough to kill. Outright, but sufficient to dull the senses. Fairley was incapacitated before the dagger struck. I stared at him, the implications sinking in. Poisoned and stabbed? I exclaimed. But why, Holmes, and how does this fit with the locked room, the missing manuscript? Read, the wax? He rose, pacing with a restless energy that belied the calm precision of his words. Why, indeed? The why is the manuscript, Watson. Its secrets are the prize, and Fairley's death, the price. The how is a matter of mechanics, and I have a theory, one I mean to test. But first, we must draw the shadow from its lair. Fetch your revolver and meet me at Fairley House in 2 hours. I shall arrive. Otherwise. Otherwise? I echoed, but he was already moving toward his bedroom, where I knew he kept the array of disguises that had often served him in his work. Resigned to his cryptic ways, I prepared myself, the weight of my revolver, a familiar comfort, as I pondered our investigation's perilous turn. 2 hours later, I stood once more before Fairley House, the fog curling about its grim facade like the tendrils of some spectral beast. Sir Percival Glyde greeted me at the door, his expression a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "Dr. Watson," he said, "where is Mr. Holmes? I expected him with you." "He'll be along," I replied, striving for nonchalance. "He's pursuing a lead. May I wait for the study? There's something I'd like to review." Sir Percival nodded, leading me upstairs, and I settled at the desk, feigning interest in the remaining manuscript pages while my ears strained for any sign of Holmes's arrival. The house was quiet, save for the distant clatter of the servants below, and I could not shake the sense that I was a pawn in a game whose rules remained hidden from me. A knock at the front door broke the stillness, followed by muffled voices in the hall. Moments later, Sir Percival returned, accompanied by a stranger, a stooped older man in a threadbare overcoat, his white hair straggling beneath a battered hat. A pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on his nose, and he clutched a leather satchel with trembling hands. "Dr. Watson," Sir Percival said, "this is Mr. Clarence Withers, a colleague of Edmund's. He's only just heard of the tragedy and insists on seeing the study."
"I thought you might wish to speak with him." The older man shuffled forward, his voice quavering as he extended a hand. "A terrible loss, sir," he said. "Edmund and I were correspondents, scholars of history, you see. I came to offer my condolences and inquire about his work. The Chronicles, is it safe?" I shook his hand, my mind racing. "Is a colleague arriving now?"
It seemed too convenient, yet I played my part, trusting Holmes's unseen hand to guide this encounter. "The manuscript, you mean? I'm afraid a lot of it was stolen last night. A dreadful business." Withers' face fell, his rheumy eyes widening.
"Stolen? Good heavens, no, that work! It was Edmund's lifeblood. Who could have done such a thing?" Before I could answer, a faint creak sounded from the passage beyond the study door. Withers stiffened, his head turning sharply, and I saw
something in his gaze, fear, perhaps, or calculation. "What was that?" he muttered, clutching his satchel tighter. "Probably the servants," I said, though my hand drifted toward my revolver. "This old house creaks like a ship at sea." He nodded, but his unease was palpable as he approached the desk, peering at the scattered pages. "These fragments, what's left of the Chronicles? May I see them? For Edmund's sake, I must know what remains." I hesitated, then stepped aside, watching as he bent over the papers. His fingers brushed the titled sheet, The Chronicles of a Forgotten Crown, and lingered there, tracing the ink as though committing it to memory. Then, with a swiftness that belied his frail appearance, he slipped the page into his satchel and turned toward the door. "Not so fast, Mr. Withers," came a voice from the shadows, a voice I knew at once, though it bore a nasal twang foreign to its usual timbre. The study door swung open, and there stood Holmes, shedding the guise of the elderly scholar like a snake with its skin. The hat and spectacles were gone, his posture straightened, and his grey eyes blazed with triumph as
he advanced. "Holmes!" I cried, leaping to my feet. "What in blazes—"
"A necessary deception, Watson," he said, his gaze fixed on the impostor, who now stood frozen, the satchel clutched to his chest. "Meet not Clarence Withers, but a man far more intimately tied to this affair. Sir Percival, lock the door. We have our thief and perhaps our murderer at last." Sir Percival obeyed, his face a mask of shock, while the stranger, caught mid-flight, dropped the satchel with a thud. "This is outrageous," he sputtered, his voice losing its quaver. "I am a scholar, sir, a friend of Fairley's." "A friend
who steals his work," Holmes retorted, circling him with predatory grace. "A friend who knows the manuscript's value well enough to risk this charade."
"No, sir, you are no Withers. I'd wager you're tied to the blue thread, the wax, the cyanide. Shall we test your coat for candle drippings, or your boots for scuff marks?" The man's bravado faltered, his hands trembling now in earnest, and I saw the net Holmes had woven tighten about him. The disguise, the staged arrival, it had been a trap, baited with the promise of the manuscript's remnants, and this shadow had stepped willingly into it. "Explain yourself," I demanded, my revolver now in hand, "or by heaven I'll haul you."
"To Scotland Yard myself!" Holmes raised a hand, his smile cold. "Patience, Watson. He'll talk. Oh, he'll talk. The game is mine and the mask is off. Let us see what lies beneath."
Chapter 7. The study of Fairley House stood still as a tableau, the gaslight casting stark shadows across the faces of its occupants. Sir Percival Glyde leaned against the locked door, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dread, while I held, my revolver steady, its barrel trained on the impostor who had masqueraded as Clarence Withers. The man himself, unmasked now in both guise and intent, stood rigid, his satchel at his feet, the stolen manuscript page a silent accusation between us. Sherlock Holmes paced before him, his lean frame taut with the energy of revelation, his voice a blade cutting through the fog of deceit. "You will forgive the theatrics, Watson," Holmes began, his eyes never leaving the culprit. "A disguise was necessary to coax our friend into the open, but let us dispense with pretense. Your name, sir, is not Withers, nor are you a scholar. Of Fairley's acquaintance, I suspect you are one James Carver, a former associate of the late Edmund Fairley, who was dismissed from his service 2 years ago under suspicion."
"Am I correct?" The man's jaw tightened, his earlier bluster giving way to a sullen glare. "You've no proof," he muttered, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "Proof?" Holmes said, his tone laced with mockery. "Oh, I have proof woven from—"
"The threads you so carelessly left behind. But come, let us unravel this tapestry step by step, for the benefit of my friends Dr. Watson and Sir Percival, who have borne this mystery with admirable patience." He turned to me, his grey eyes alight with the thrill of exposition. "We begin with the crime itself. Edmund Fairley was found dead in a locked study, a dagger in his back, the key inside, the windows latched." "Suicide," Lestrade insisted, and a tempting conclusion, save for the inconsistencies. A man does not stab himself in the back with such force, nor does he lock the door after the deed.
"No, this was murder, and the locked room was a deliberate illusion," I nodded, my mind racing to keep pace. "But how, Holmes? There was no way in or out of the door, the windows." Holmes smiled a faint, triumphant curve. There was a way, Watson, one,
hidden in plain sight. But first, the method of death. The dagger was the final stroke, but not the first. Recall the tumbler, the whiskey with its bitter undertone, the scent of almonds. Cyanide, as my tests confirmed, laced into Fairley's. Drink! Not a lethal dose, but enough to render him drowsy, helpless. The killer entered, struck with the dagger, and staged the scene to suggest suicide. Sir Percival gasped, his hand clutching the doorframe. Poisoned? But who? How did they get in? Holmes held up a hand, forestalling further questions. Patience, Sir Percival. The who stands before us, and the how lies in the mechanics of the room. Let us turn to the clues. First, the blue silk thread, found beneath the armchair, alien to Fairley's attire. Then the wax smear, fresh upon the carpet, and the scuff marks, one in the study, one in the servants' hall. These were the footprints of our shadow, and they led me to a hypothesis. He crossed to the hearth, his fingers brushing the mantel. This fireplace, Watson, unlit when we arrived, yet the wax suggested a candle had been used. Why? Fairley preferred gaslight, as Sir Percival confirmed. I examined the chimney this morning while you slept, a narrow flue but passable for a slender man, the scuff marks aligned with the hearth, and the wax dripped from a candle held aloft as the intruder descended. Descended? I exclaimed, incredulity warring with awe. You mean the killer came down the chimney? Precisely, Holmes replied. A feat of agility, but not impossible. James Carver here, note his wiry build, was once a clerk in Fairley's employ, privy to the house's secrets, including its antiquated chimneys. Dismissed for pilfering, he harboured a grudge and greed for Fairley's manuscript, which he knew held value beyond mere scholarship. Carver's eyes flashed, but he remained silent, as Holmes continued. The sequence, then. Carver, aware of Fairley's habits, slipped cyanide into the whiskey decanter earlier that day, perhaps during a clandestine visit under some pretext. That night, he returned, scaling the roof in the fog's cover. He descended the chimney, candle in hand, the blue silk thread tearing from his coat as he brushed the armchair. Fairley, dulled by the poison, offered no resistance. Carver stabbed him with the dagger, a weapon Fairley kept on display, locked the door with the key already inside, and ascended the chimney once more, leaving the room sealed. But the manuscript, Sir Percival interjected. Why take it now?
After the murder? Holmes turned to him, his expression grave. Because, Sir Percival, the murder was but the prelude. Carver returned last night, again via the chimney, to claim his prize.
Chronicles of a Forgotten Crown, a work Fairley boasted would rewrite history, likely contained revelations of royal lineage or buried treasure, a fortune Carver sought to exploit. He took the bulk of it, leaving scraps to avoid suspicion, but my trap tonight ensnared him when he dared to steal the rest. I stared at Carver, the pieces falling into place with a clarity that left me breathless. The thread was from his coat, not Reed's waistcoat? A deliberate misdirection, Holmes said. Reed's nervousness was genuine. He feared suspicion, not guilt. Carver planted the thread to cast doubt elsewhere, but his wax and boots betrayed him. The cyanide was Watson's secret clue. Fairley could not have sought the almond scent. Pointed to premeditation. From there, the chimney was the only egress. Carver snarled, his composure cracking. "You've no witnesses, Holmes. No court will hang me on wax and threads." Holmes stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "No witnesses, perhaps, but your coat. Check the lining, and your scuffed and wax-stained boots will speak for you." I'll find the cyanide residue in your lodgings as well. You overplayed your hand, Carver, and the game is mine." The man sagged, defeat etching his features, and I lowered my revolver, marveling at the intricate web Holmes had unwound. The locked room, the poison, the theft, all resolved in a cascade of logic that left me humbled and exhilarated. The "aha" surged within me, a testament to the genius I had the privilege to chronicle. "By Jove, Holmes," I said, "you've done it again. A chimney? Who'd have thought it?" He shrugged, his arrogance tempered by a flicker of amusement. "The improbable, Watson, is often the inevitable. Now, Sir Percival, unlock that door. Lestrade must be summoned. Our shadow has much to answer for." Chapter 8. The Study of Fairleigh. House, so recently a stage for deception and revelation, now bore witness to the sombre denouement of our strange adventure. Sir Percival Glyde, his composure restored by James Carver's unmasking, unlocked the door at Holmes's command, and within the hour Inspector Lestrade arrived, his wiry frame bustling with the officious energy of Scotland Yard. The fog outside had begun to lift as though the elements conspired to clear the haze that had cloaked this grim affair. Carver stood sullen and silent as Lestrade clapped handcuffs upon his wrists, his earlier defiance extinguished by the weight of Holmes' evidence. With its pilfered page, the satchel lay upon the desk, a mute testament to his greed, while his coat, hastily searched, yielded a torn lining of blue silk and a sole smudged with candle wax. These, combined with Holmes's promise of cyanide, traces in Carver's lodgings, formed a chain of proof no court could easily break. "Well, Holmes," Lestrade said, tipping his hat with a grudging nod. "You've outdone yourself this time. A chimney, eh? I'd have sworn it was suicide, or that footman Reed, at a pinch. How you sniffed out this Carver fellow, I'll never know." Holmes waved a dismissive hand, his expression one of mild impatience. "You had the facts before you, Lestrade. The whiskey, the wax, the thread. It was merely a matter of seeing them aright. But do take him away, I've no further use for him." As Lestrade escorted Carver from the room, the clink of the handcuffs echoed faintly down the corridor, a sound that seemed to draw a line beneath the tragedy of Edmund Fairleigh. Sir Percival sank into a chair, his silver hair dishevelled, his voice heavy with relief. "I can scarcely believe it, Mr. Holmes," he said. "My brother-in-law was murdered by a man he trusted, his work stolen for some mad scheme. What was it all for?" "The Chronicles of a Forgotten Crown," Holmes replied, retrieving the titled page from the desk and handing it to him. Fairleigh hinted at rewriting history, a claim Carver took to mean wealth or power, perhaps a lost royal claim or buried treasure. We may never know the full truth with so much of the manuscript lost, but greed was Carver's spur, and it drove him to murder. I watched as Sir Percival clutched the page, his eyes tracing the familiar script, and I felt a pang of sorrow for the scholar whose life had been so brutally extinguished. "A dreadful waste," I murmured. "To think Fairleigh died for words on a page, and that we'll never read them." Holmes turned to me, his gaze softening for a moment. "Words, Watson, have toppled empires and raised fortunes. Fairleigh's were dangerous enough to kill for, and that is their epitaph. But come, our work here is done. Sir Percival, I leave. The rest to you and the Yard." We took our leave of Fairleigh House, stepping into a London now bathed in the weak light of a late October afternoon. The fog had retreated, revealing the familiar contours of Bloomsbury's streets, yet I carried a lingering sense of the shadows we had dispelled. As we walked toward Baker Street, I reflected on the extraordinary mind beside me, a mind that had pierced the locked room, the poison, and the theft with a clarity I could only marvel at. "Holmes," I said at length, "I'll never fathom how you saw it all, the chimney, the cyanide, Carver's very name. It's as though you read the story backward, from end to beginning." He chuckled, a low, dry sound that carried the faintest warmth.
"Not backward, Watson, but outward. From the center of the web to its edges. The clues were there, whispering their tale. I merely listened. You saw them too, but you lack the habit of synthesis."
"Perhaps," I conceded, smiling despite myself. "But I'll write this one up, mark my words. The public will lap it up. A locked room murder, a chimney descent, a manuscript worth a man's life. They'll call it one of your finest." He shrugged, his arrogance tempered by indifference. "Write it if you must, though I dare say you'll embellish the fog and the revolver. Just keep my name out of the papers. I've no patience for the clamour it brings." We reached 221B as dusk settled over the city, the fire in our rooms a welcome contrast to the chill we'd left behind. I decided at my desk, my notebook brimming with the case details, while Holmes took up his pipe and gazed into the flames. The echoes of Fairley House lingered, the dagger, the wax, the stolen pages, but they were fading now, subsumed by the quiet triumph of justice served. Once more, I was struck by the privilege of standing witness to Sherlock Holmes's genius, a light that burned brightest in the darkest of riddles. Chapter 9. The fire crackled merrily in the grate of our Baker Street rooms, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill of the October evening that pressed against the windows. I sat at my desk, my pen poised above the final lines of my notes on the Fairley affair, while Sherlock Holmes reclined in his armchair, his pipe sending tendrils of smoke curling toward the ceiling. The silence between us was companionable, a rare interlude after the tumult of the past days, and yet I could not resist one last attempt to draw him out. "Holmes," I said, setting my pen aside, "you must admit it. This business with Carver and the manuscript was a triumph. A locked room, a poisoner descending a chimney, a stolen work of history. It's the stuff of legend. Surely even you feel—"
"A flicker of pride?" He exhaled a slow plume of smoke, his grey eyes half-lidded as he gazed into the fire. "Pride, Watson? A fleeting indulgence for lesser minds. The case was a puzzle, nothing more, a tangle of threads to be sorted and snipped. I solved it because it was there to be solved, not for applause or laurels." I shook my head, smiling at his familiar detachment. "You'll never change, will you? Most men would crow over such a feat, unmasking a murderer with wax and a thread, outwitting Scotland Yard yet again. But you sit there as though it were a morning stroll." He turned his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at his lips.
"And you, my dear Watson, will never cease to romanticize it. The wax was a signpost, the thread a marker, plain as day to anyone who looks. As for Scotland Yard, their blindness is no measure of my sight. Let them blunder, it keeps me occupied." I chuckled, conceding the point, though my admiration remained undimmed. "Well, I'll write it all the same. The public deserves to know how you turned a locked room into an open book. And that manuscript, what a pity we'll never learn its full tale. The Chronicles of a Forgotten Crown sounds like something out of a romance." Holmes's smirk faded, replaced by a contemplative frown. "A pity, perhaps, but not a loss. As Carver proved, words on a page can stir men to madness, yet they are but shadows of the deeds they chronicle. Fairley sought to resurrect a past that others preferred buried, likely some royal scandal or lost claim, and it cost him his life. The true crown, Watson, lies not in ink, but in the minds that wield it. Let it rest with him." His words hung in the air, a philosophical note that lingered like the smoke from his pipe, and I pondered the deeper currents he so often glimpsed. Before I could press him further, a sharp rap at the door broke the stillness. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon her silver tray, expressing mild reproach at the hour. "A message for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing it over. "From some foreign gentleman by the sound of it. I do hope it's not another of your midnight escapades." Holmes tore open the envelope with a flicker of interest, his eyes scanning the brief lines. "From Count von Cram," he murmured. "A matter of discretion in Bohemia."
"It seems our respite is short-lived, Watson. Pack your bag. We leave for the continent tomorrow." I rose with a mixture of weariness and excitement, the Fairley case already receding into memory as a new adventure beckoned. Bohemia? Good Lord. "Holmes, what now?" He folded the telegram and tucked it into his pocket, his gaze drifting back to the fire. "A trifle, no doubt. Kings and crowns again, but of a different sort. The game never ends, Watson. It merely changes its board. Rest. But we have a train to catch."
As Mrs. Hudson bustled out and I turned to my room, I cast one last glance at him. Sherlock Holmes, the enigma who unravelled mysteries as effortlessly as others breathed, yet dismissed his genius with a shrug. The affair of the unfinished manuscript had been a dark and winding path, its secrets half revealed, half lost, and yet it was but one chapter in the endless saga of his mind. With a sense of awe and insatiable curiosity, I closed my notebook. I prepared for the morrow, knowing that wherever Holmes led, I would follow, into the fog, the shadows, and the light beyond. Chapter 10. The morning of November 1st broke with a crispness that dispelled the last vestiges of the fog, bathing Baker Street in a pale, wintry light. I stood at our window, my Gladstone bag packed and waiting by the door, watching the bustle of London awaken below, cabbies shouting, newsboys hawking their wares, the ceaseless tide of humanity that Holmes so often observed with detached fascination. Behind me, he moved with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to sudden departures, his violin case and a small valise already in hand. The events of the Fairley case lingered in my mind like the aftertaste of a strong brandy, sharp, complex, and not easily dismissed. I turned from the window, my thoughts drifting to the locked study, the stolen manuscript, and James Carver's descent into infamy. "Holmes," I said, breaking the morning's stillness, "do you ever wonder what Fairley's chronicles might have revealed? A lost crown, a buried secret. It feels unfinished somehow." He paused while donning his overcoat, his sharp features softened by the light streaming through the panes. "Unfinished, Watson? The case is closed, the murderer caged. What more is there to wonder? Fairley's tale ended with his life, and Carver's greed wrote its final line. The rest is speculation, and I deal in facts, not fancies." "True enough," I conceded, "but the human side nags at me. A man pours his soul into a work, only to vanish in blood and theft. There's a tragedy there beyond the crime." Holmes adjusted, his scarf with a deft flick, his expression inscrutable. "Tragedy is the lot of those who chase phantoms, Watson, whether of the past or the future. Fairley sought to resurrect history, and it buried him instead. If there's a lesson, it's that the dead keep their secrets better than the living. Now come, the boat train waits for no man, not even a sentimental chronicler." I smiled at his barb, shouldering my bag as we descended to the street. A hansom cab stood ready, its driver tipping his hat as we climbed aboard, and soon we were rattling toward Victoria Station, the familiar landmarks of London slipping past in a blur. The prospect of Bohemia, a land of kings and intrigue, stirred my blood, yet I could not entirely shake the shadow of Fairley House. Holmes, as ever, seemed untroubled, his mind already leaping to the next challenge, the telegram from Count von Cram, a spark to his restless intellect. I ventured one last reflection as the cab jostled through the crowded streets. You know, Holmes, it's a queer thing. Each case you solve seems to peel back a layer of the world, yet there's always another beneath it. Fairley's Manuscript Carver's plot. It's like a book with half its pages torn out, and we're left guessing at the story. He glanced at me, his grey eyes glinting with a rare hint of mischief. Then write your ending, Watson. Embellish it with fog and heroics, as you're wont to do, but leave the guessing to poets and priests. I prefer the chase to the conclusion. There's more truth in the hunt than in the quarry. The cab drew to a halt, and we stepped onto the platform, the whistle of the departing train a clarion call to the unknown. I watched Holmes stride ahead, his tall figure cutting through the throng, and felt that familiar surge of admiration tinged with wonder. The affair of the unfinished manuscript had been a dark, twisting thread in the tapestry of his career, its mysteries resolved, yet its echoes enduring. Now, as we boarded the train for Dover and beyond, I knew another chapter awaited, one I would chronicle with the same awe and curiosity that had bound me to him from the first. The carriage lurched forward, and London faded into the distance, a city of secrets left behind. Ahead lay Bohemia, with Hit, the promise of new shadows to chase and new webs to unravel. Holmes settled into his seat, his pipe already lit, and I opened my notebook once more, ready to capture whatever lay on the unseen horizon. Chapter 11. The boat train rattled across the Kentish countryside, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to the restless energy that seemed to emanate from Sherlock Holmes. He sat opposite me in our compartment, his long legs stretched before him, his pipe unlit but clenched between his teeth as he studied the telegram from Count von Cram with an intensity that belied his earlier nonchalance. The Fairley case, with its locked rooms and lost manuscripts, lay behind us, yet I sensed its echoes in how his fingers drummed against the armrest, a mind already turning from one puzzle to the next. The crossing at Dover was swift, the channel's choppy waters, giving way to the continent's smoother rails. By evening, we were aboard an express bound for Prague. I had managed a fitful nap, lulled by the train's motion. Still I awoke to find Holmes poring over a map of Bohemia, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering gaslight overhead. "Holmes," I said, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, "you've been at that telegram for hours. What's this Count von Cram about? Another locked room mystery, I suppose?" He folded the map with a crisp snap, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Not quite, Watson, though it promises its complexities. The Count is a discreet emissary. His name is likely a fiction, a veil for someone higher in the Bohemian court. His message is brief but suggestive. A document of delicate import has vanished, and its recovery demands a mind untainted by local loyalties. I suspect we're dealing with a royal indiscretion, perhaps a letter or a treaty that could
topple more than a desk if mishandled. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite my weariness. A royal indiscretion?
Sounds like Fairley's Chronicles all over again, secrets worth killing for. Perhaps, Holmes replied, leaning back with a faint smile. But where Fairley's work was a scholar's dream, this is a politician's nightmare, living, breathing, and very much in play. The Count promises details upon our arrival, but I've already wired ahead to confirm his credentials. We shall see if Bohemia's shadows are as deep as London's. The train slowed as we approached Prague, its spires piercing the dusk like the teeth of some ancient beast. A carriage awaited us at the station, its driver a taciturn fellow in a dark cloak who spoke little English but gestured us aboard with a curt nod. The streets of the old city wound narrow and cobbled, their medieval charm tempered by an air of secrecy that hung as thick as the fog we'd left behind. At length, we drew up before a discreet townhouse, its windows shuttered, its door marked only by a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. The man who greeted us was tall and imposing, his silver hair swept back from a lined forehead, and his attire a blend of aristocratic elegance and military precision. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his accent clipped and Germanic. "I am Count von Cram, or so you may call me. Dr. Watson, I presume? Come in, gentlemen. The hour is late, and our business urgent." We followed him into a drawing room of understated opulence, velvet drapes, a roaring fire, a decanter of ruby red, wine upon a sideboard. Von Cram wasted no time, producing a sealed envelope from his coat and handing it to Holmes. "This is the matter at hand," he said, his voice low. "A letter, penned by a certain exalted personage, has been stolen from a private study in the Hradčany castle. Its contents, if revealed, could ignite a scandal reaching beyond Bohemia's borders. We believe it is still in Prague, but the thief is cunning and silent." Holmes broke the seal, scanning the note within. A single page of instructions written, in a firm, elegant hand. "No ransom demand yet," he mused, "and the theft was discovered only yesterday. A locked study, you say? How was entry gained?" Von Cram hesitated, his fingers tightening on the arm of his chair. The door was intact, the key accounted for, yet a window was found ajar high above the courtyard, too narrow for a man, or so the guards thought. "The castle is a fortress, Mr. Holmes, yet this breach defies us." I caught Holmes's eye, a flicker of recognition passing between us. "Another impossible entry," I said, half to myself. "Like Fairley's chimney, there were windows a different beast." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his tone sharpening. "A window too narrow for a man suggests a child, a trained animal, or a device. Watson, note the parallel, but let us not leap to chimneys yet. Count, I'll need access to the study and a list of all who knew of this letter's existence. Discretion, I assume, is paramount?" "Absolute," Von Cram affirmed. "The king himself has entrusted this to me, and now to you. Fail, and the consequences will ripple far beyond Prague." Holmes pocketed the envelope, his demeanor shifting to that keen alertness I knew so well. "Then we begin at dawn. Watson, rest if you can. This promises to tax even your indefatigable pen. Count, expect me at the castle by 8. As Von Cram showed us to our rooms, I felt the familiar thrill of a new chase stirring within me. The Fairley case had been a dark labyrinth of greed and murder, its manuscript a ghost that haunted my thoughts. But this Bohemian affair, with its royal stakes and subtle menace, was a fresh canvas for Holmes's genius. I settled into bed, the distant tolling of a church bell lulling me towards sleep, and wondered what secrets awaited us in the shadow of Hradčany Castle. With Holmes at the helm, I had no doubt they would be laid bare, yet the journey, as ever, promised to be as enigmatic as the man himself. Chapter 12. The morning sun struggled through a veil of clouds as our carriage climbed the steep road to Hradčany Castle, its turrets looming over Prague like silent sentinels. I had managed a few hours of sleep, though the weight of our new task and the lingering echoes of Fairley's fate kept my mind restless. Sherlock Holmes, by contrast, sat beside me with the poised alertness of a hound on the scent, his eyes darting over the ancient stonework as we approached the castle gates. Count von Cram awaited us there, his stern figure flanked by 2 guards in crisp uniforms, their faces impassive as they waved us through. The study lay within the castle's royal wing, a chamber of austere elegance, polished oak panels, a tanchal marble fireplace, and a dark wood desk bearing the faint scratches of countless quills. A single high and narrow window pierced the wall above, its latch undone, and its frame admitting a chill draught. Holmes wasted no time, his long fingers tracing the desk's edge as von Kram recounted the theft's discovery. "The letter was kept here," the Count said, tapping an empty locked drawer. "A maid found the window ajar at dawn yesterday. No alarm raised, no guards disturbed. The king was in residence, yet none heard a sound." Holmes knelt by the desk, his magnifying glass glinting as he examined the floor. "No dust displaced here," he murmured, "but a faint scratch, metal perhaps." He rose and crossed to the window, peering up at the narrow slit, some 15 feet above the parquet. "Too small for a man, you say? Yet wide enough for ingenuity. Watson, hand me that chair." I obliged, dragging a heavy armchair beneath the window, and Holmes climbed atop it with the agility of a cat. He leaned out, his head nearly brushing the stone sill, then withdrew with a faint exclamation. "A thread, Watson. Black cotton, caught on a splinter. And here—" He produced a small metal hook, no larger than a fish hook, from the frame's edge. A grappling tool delicately applied. Our thief is no brute, but a craftsman. Von Kram frowned, his hands clasped behind his back. A hook, but the drop to the courtyard is sheer, 40 feet at least. And the guards patrol below. Holmes descended, pocketing the hook and thread. A rope, then, slender, silent, lowered from the roof. The thief scaled down, entered, and exited the same way, leaving the window ajar in haste. The letter's absence suggests precision, not plunder. Only what was sought was taken. He turned to the Count, his voice crisp. "Who knew of this letter's location? Servants? Courtiers?" "Only 3, von Kram replied. "The king's private secretary, the chamberlain, and myself. The maid who cleans here is illiterate, beyond suspicion." Holmes's eyes narrowed, a spark of interest flaring. 3 then, and one with a motive yet unseen. I'll need their names and movements, Count. This is no common theft, but a strike at the heart of power. Watson, note the thread and hook, small, keys to a larger lock. I scribbled dutifully, though the parallels to Fairley's case struck me anew. A locked space breached, a document stolen, a shadow moving unseen. "Another manuscript in a way," I said. "But this time a king's secrets
are at stake."
"Indeed," Holmes replied, his tone dry. "And where Fairley's tale ended in blood, this one may spill more if we falter. Count, I'll return this evening with a plan. Our quarry moves swiftly, and so must we." As we left the study, the castle's stone walls seemed to whisper of intrigues older than the theft we pursued, and I felt the weight of a new game settling upon us. Holmes's deductive flair had shone once more, the hook, the thread, the rope, a prelude to the chase ahead. Yet the shadow of Fairley's unfinished work lingered, a reminder that some secrets defied his grasp. Chapter 13. The train back to London rocked gently beneath us, the Bohemian countryside fading into the twilight as we retraced our steps across the continent. It had been a whirlwind 48 hours since our arrival in Prague. The letter recovered, the thief unmasked, as the king's chamberlain, driven by blackmail and a rival court's gold. Holmes had set a trap with a forged duplicate, luring the culprit into a midnight confession beneath the castle's eaves, and von Kram's gratitude had been as effusive as his discretion allowed. Now, with the affair concluded, we sat in our compartment, the rhythm of the rails a soothing balm after the tension of our task. I leaned back, my notebook open to the final entries of this dual saga, the Fairley murder and the Bohemian theft, marveling at how they wove together yet stood apart. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence. "It's a queer symmetry. 2 locked rooms, 2 stolen documents, one a scholar's dream, the other a king's peril. You've tied them both with the same thread of logic." He glanced at me from beneath the brim of his travelling cap, his pipe glowing faintly in the dim light. "Symmetry, Watson? It's a fanciful notion. The cases were distinct. Fairley's a tale of greed and murder, Bohemia's of politics and betrayal. If there is one, the thread is human folly, ever the same, whatever the stage." I smiled, undeterred by his pragmatism. "Folly or not, you have a knack for turning the impossible into the inevitable. Carver's chimney, the Chamberlain's rope. Most would see magic where you see mechanics." He exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his expression softening into something almost indulgent. "Magic is for conjurers, Watson, and I am no stage performer. The world is a machine, complex but governed by rules. I merely read its workings where others see chaos. As for my knack, it's a habit of observation honed by necessity. You do well to practice it, though I fear your pen prefers drama to detail." "Guilty as charged," I laughed, closing my notebook. "But the public will eat this up. 2 mysteries in one, from London's fog to Prague's spires. I'll call it the unfinished manuscript. I think it fits Fairley's tale, and this Bohemian letter leaves its questions unanswered." Holmes shrugged, his gaze drifting to the window where the last light of day surrendered to night. "Call it what you will, but spare me the headlines. The manuscript was unfinished because its author died. The letter's secrets remain because they must. Both are threads in a larger weave. Cut short or knotted tight, they matter little in the end. The mind craves the next tangle, not the last." His words carried a weight I'd come to recognize, a philosophy that saw life as an endless series of puzzles, each solved only to reveal another. I thought of Fairley, his chronicles lost to flame or theft, and the Bohemian king, his honor preserved. By Holmes's silence, 2 men, 2 secrets, bridged by a mind that refused to rest. As the train bore us homeward, I felt a quiet awe settle over me, not just for the cases we'd closed, but for the man who saw beyond their edges. Back at 291B, the fire would await, and with it, the promise of new telegrams, new shadows to chase. Holmes settled into silence, his pipe a beacon in the dark, and I let my thoughts drift, content to follow where he led. The unfinished manuscript of Fairley, of Bohemia, of all we'd yet to uncover, was a tale without end, and in that I found a curious peace. For as long as Sherlock Holmes lived, the story would continue, its threads stretching ever toward the unseen.